The word wife reached Agnes Bell through a half-inch gap in the study door, and she did not at first understand that it was meant for her. She had come only to collect the small, precise sum owed her for a quarter's wages as companion to a lady now 3 days buried, and to say she required no character reference, since she did not imagine any house in the county would hire the woman who had been alone with old Lady Prue when she died. She would remember this morning longest, afterward, though she did not know it yet. Standing in the cold passage with her gloves already on, listening to 2 men discuss a marriage as though it were a shipment of grain. Terms plain and sentiment set aside, said the deeper of the 2 voices, and something in the flatness of it made her go very still, the stillness of a woman who has learned that the safest thing in any room is to be mistaken for furniture. She did not open the door. She did not need to. A second voice, softer, silkier, the kind of voice that seemed to apologize for existing even while it cut, answered that Michaelmas was 7 weeks off, and that 7 weeks was not long to find a bride willing to marry a stranger for no reason a sensible woman could name. Long enough, said the first voice. I do not require a woman with reasons. I require a wife by Michaelmas, and I will have one. Agnes had spent 6 years learning to read what people did not say, first over her father's ledgers, and then over an old woman's failing moods, and what she heard under the Duke of Harrow's words was not romance, and was not cruelty either. It was arithmetic. She turned to go, because eavesdropping on a duke's private business was not a habit she meant to acquire on the last morning she would ever stand in this house, and the door opened before she had taken 2 steps. Miss Bell, said Gideon Ashford, Duke of Harrow, and he said it the way a man reads a name off a list, not unkindly, only exactly. He did not ask why she was in the passage. He looked at her the way he might have looked at a column of figures that had, against expectation, come out even, and something behind his eyes moved and was suppressed before it reached his mouth. Sir, she said, and dropped the small curtsy owed a duke, and prepared to say goodbye to a house she had scrubbed her grief clean inside for 3 days, because grief was not a thing that could be afforded when one had nowhere to spend it. Instead, he asked her to come in. The other man in the room was slighter than the Duke, fair, beautifully dressed in a way that made his coat look like an argument for his own good taste, and he studied her with the pleasant, assessing warmth of a man pricing a horse he did not intend to buy. Simon Price, he said, offering his hand as though they were already old friends, my cousin's man of business, and yours too, I hope, before long. And he smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes, and Agnes understood before either man had said another word that this was a person whose gentleness she should never mistake for safety. The Duke did not sit. He stood at the window with his hands behind his back, a man built along heavy, deliberate lines, grief worn into him the way weather wears into stone, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to the register she had heard through the door, the register of a man conducting business he had already decided upon and only needed to announce. I require a wife before Michaelmas, Miss Bell, he said, not out of affection, since I have none to spare, and would not insult you by pretending otherwise, out of necessity, which I will not trouble you with the particulars of today. You require a home and an income, unless I mistake the situation entirely. I am offering both, on terms that ask nothing of you but your name and your discretion. She should have been afraid. Some cooler, more sensible part of her noted that she was not, that she was instead doing what she always did when the ground moved, which was to hold very still and count what remained solid. My father kept books for 20 years, she said, before he was ruined by a page he did not write. I have some experience judging when a bargain is honestly stated. Is this one? Price's smile did not move, but something behind it did, a small flinching thing, gone before she could be certain she had seen it. The Duke, for the first time, looked at her the way one looks at a person rather than a solution. "Every word of it," he said. "That is the whole of what I will promise you today." She did not know yet what the bargain would cost her, or that the 7 weeks between this morning and Michaelmas would be the hinge on which an old man's stolen honor and a young girl's safety and her own long-buried father's name would all, unbeknownst to her, turn together. Had she known, she would have said yes exactly as quickly. Michaelmas, she thought, testing the word the way she tested a column before trusting its sum, and found that some part of her had already, treacherously, begun to count the weeks. She said yes in the same voice she would have used to accept a position keeping accounts, because that, as far as she could tell, was precisely what she had been offered, and the Duke received her answer with a short nod that might, in a warmer man, have been relief. "Then," said he, "we understand one another. My solicitor will draw the settlements this week. You will want for nothing material, Miss Bell, and I will want for nothing beyond your name upon a register before the last day of September." Price, watching them both with his pleasant, unhurried attention, observed that it was a very tidy arrangement, and Agnes noted, filing it away the way she had once filed a discrepancy of 3 shillings in a merchant's account, that he had said tidy the way another man might have said convenient, and that his eyes had gone for half a second to the Duke's hands rather than his face. "There is one condition," the Duke said. And here, for the only time that morning, he hesitated, a fractional pause that a woman less trained in reading silences might have missed entirely. "You will ask me nothing of my reasons until I choose to give them. I do not say this to be cruel. I say it because there are people in this house whose safety depends on my reasons remaining mine a while longer, and I have found that the surest way to keep a secret is to burden no one else with carrying it before they must." Agnes considered this. A lesser woman, she thought, would have called it an insult, being asked to marry a stranger's silence along with his name. But she had spent her whole short adult life being handed other people's silences to carry. First her dying father's, then old Lady Prue's, and she had grown expert, without ever choosing to, at the particular dignity of not asking. "I have never yet been paid to ask questions, Your Grace," she said. "Only to keep good accounts. I imagine I can keep this one as well." Something crossed his face then that was not quite a smile, a loosening at the corner of his mouth so brief she might have invented it, and Price, watching, laughed a short, delighted laugh that did not reach any part of him below his collar. "Well," he said, rising and drawing on his gloves with unhurried grace, "I shall leave the two of you to grow acquainted with your convenient stranger, cousin, and see myself out before I am asked to be glad for you, which I confess I find myself only halfway able to manage." He bowed to Agnes with exaggerated courtesy, a bow just a fraction too deep to be entirely respectful, and at the door he paused. "Miss Bell," he said, "you have a very steady face. I dare say it will serve you well in this house." It was not delivered as a compliment, and she did not receive it as one. When he had gone, the housekeeper was sent for, a broad, gray, formidable woman named Mrs. Tatch, who arrived already sizing Agnes up with the frank, unblinking assessment of a woman who had buried 3 husbands and outlasted every duchess this house had employed. "So you're the new one," she said, before anyone had introduced them. "Well, you've a plain face and a plain name, and you didn't faint when his lordship told you the terms, which is 3 points in your favor already, and more than the last 2 managed between them." Agnes asked, cautiously, what had become of the last 2, and Mrs. Tatch snorted. "Ran off, one of them, when she understood there'd be no love in it. The other stayed a fortnight and complained the whole while that the house was cold, which it is, and that his lordship never smiled, which he doesn't. And I told her plainly, smiling wasn't in the contract, girl. Read it again. Agnes found, to her own faint surprise, that she wanted to smile herself, and did not entirely suppress it, and Mrs. Tatch caught the flicker and nodded once, satisfied, as if a column had been totaled correctly. "You'll do," she said. "Come along then. I'll show you where a duchess is meant to sleep, though I warn you the last one who slept there left nothing behind but dust and a great deal of complaining." As they climbed, Agnes asked, carefully, what manner of man the Duke had been before grief made him so exact, and Mrs. Tatch's face changed, briefly, into something older and sadder. His father died owing more than anyone but Mr. Price ever saw the full account of, she said, and his mother before that, and there's a young sister upstairs who's had more sorrow in 16 years than most see in 80, and his lordship has carried the whole of it alone since he was 25, because he's the sort who believes a burden shared is a burden doubled rather than halved. It is not, in my long experience, true, Mrs. Tatch added, but you'll have a difficult time convincing him of it. Agnes said nothing, but she carried the words with her up the last flight of stairs, the way she carried every ledger she had ever balanced, quietly, and for keeping. The wedding, when it came a fortnight later, was a small legal thing conducted with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction, which was, Agnes reflected, precisely what it had been advertised as, and she did not allow herself to be troubled by how little that troubled her. Simon Price attended as a witness, immaculate in gray, and kissed her hand at the wedding breakfast with a warmth so perfectly calibrated that only a woman trained to read faces for a living would have noticed it did not travel past his wrist. "My dear cousin," he said, "for we are cousins now, are we not, in the loosest and most agreeable sense? You must let me be the first to say how very glad I am that Gideon has found himself so sensible a bride." Sensible was, she was coming to understand, the word this house used when it meant something else entirely, and she thanked him with a composure that gave nothing away. Because giving nothing away was, she had learned early, the only inheritance her father had managed to leave her free and clear. In the weeks that followed, the county came to look her over the way one looks over a new horse in a neighbor's stable, curious and faintly proprietary, and she bore their calls with the same steady patience she had once spent on merchants' columns, smiling exactly enough and never a fraction more, until the callers went away uncertain whether they had met a fool or a woman, keeping something carefully behind her teeth. It was during the third week that the Duke, meeting her in the passage outside the estate office with an armful of ledgers he seemed unwilling to relinquish to anyone else, stopped and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You kept your father's accounts," he said, "not merely watched him keep them." "I did the sums myself from the age of 11, she said, when his hand began to fail, though he signed his name to every page as though it were still his own work, because a clerk's honesty was the only capital he had left to leave me." He was silent long enough that she thought the conversation had ended, and then, in the tone of a man setting down a great weight with great care, he asked whether she would be willing to look over the estate accounts for him, a page at a time. In the evenings, when the house was quiet. "I would trust few people with this," he said, and stopped, as though he had said more than he intended, and Agnes, watching the muscle work once in his jaw, understood that she had just been handed the edge of something far larger than household bookkeeping, though she could not yet have said what. "I should like that very much, Your Grace," she said, and meant it more than she expected to, and did not yet know that the ledgers he was about to place in her hands held, buried 3 years deep in careful, patient forgery, the answer to every question he had forbidden her to ask. They began that same evening in the estate office, a low fire lit against the autumn chill, 2 candles between them, and a stack of leather-bound books that smelled of dust and old ink, and Agnes discovered within the first hour that working beside the Duke of Harrow was nothing like being married to him at breakfast, where he spoke 6 words and ate in the manner of a man completing an obligation. Here, bent over a column with his sleeves pushed back and his hair coming loose from its queue, he was a different creature entirely, quick and exacting and, she began to suspect, quietly delighted by precision in a way he permitted himself nowhere else. "That entry is wrong," she said on the second night, tapping a line with one ink-stained finger. "Not wrong," he said, without looking up, "merely inconvenient." She looked at him until he looked back. "It is wrong," she said again, "because the sum in the margin does not match the sum in the column, and a man does not make that error twice in the same hand unless he wishes the reader to stop checking his margins." Something shifted in his face, an alertness she had not seen there before, quick and wary as an animal scenting a change in the wind, and he asked her, very carefully, to show him precisely where. She did. He was quiet for a long time afterward, turning the page toward the candle, and when he finally spoke, it was not about the ledger at all. "My father died, believing himself a careful man," he said. "He was not careless, but he trusted the wrong hand with the family's figures for the last 3 years of his life, and I have spent every year since trying to prove it without being certain what I was trying to prove." Agnes did not ask whose hand. She had promised not to ask, and she kept the promise, though she filed the shape of the silence away exactly as she had once filed a stranger's discrepancy, for keeping. Instead, she asked whether she might see the rest of the year's entries, and he pushed the whole stack toward her without hesitation, which she understood, without being told, to be a kind of answer in itself. It was 3 evenings later, coming down to the kitchens in search of a second candle, when the household ones had all mysteriously vanished, that she heard laughter coming from behind the scullery door, high and unrestrained. The laughter of children who did not yet know they were meant to be quiet in a duke's house. She pushed the door open on a scene that had no business existing in a house this cold, 3 kitchen children, ragged and bright-eyed, orphans taken in for scullery work because the alternative was the parish, gathered round the flour bin with a game of their own invention, tossing dried peas into an old tea caddy for a prize the cook had promised of 1 sugared plum apiece. The smallest of them, a boy of perhaps 6, called Ferris, missed his throw entirely and struck Agnes squarely on the shoe, and looked up in open terror at the sight of a lady in silk standing in the scullery doorway. She did not scold him. She had spent her whole childhood being the plain, overlooked girl in rooms too grand for her, and she recognized his fear the way she recognized a column that would not balance, at a glance, and knew exactly what was needed to correct it. She knelt, gathered the pea from the floor, and threw it herself, missing the caddy by a wider margin than his had, which was not entirely an accident. The children's laughter, when it came, was helpless and immediate, and she found herself laughing with them, freely, in a way she had not laughed since her father died, until a small girl named Biddy declared that the new Duchess threw worse than Ferris and ought to be given lessons. It was in the middle of that laughter, unguarded and entirely her own, that Agnes looked up and saw the Duke standing in the passage doorway, having come, she would learn later, in search of her about a figure in the very ledgers they had been studying, and stopped there, unnoticed, watching her with an expression she had not yet learned to read, because she had never seen it on his face before. It was Ferris who broke the moment, tugging at her sleeve to ask whether she would throw again, and it was the Duke's voice, low and strange with something that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, that answered instead. "Best let her try again, Ferris," he said. I am told the Bells were never much good at games of chance. They preferred a certainty. The children scattered at the sight of him, the way children always did, but Agnes remained where she was, kneeling on the scullery floor with a dried pea still in her hand, and saw, before he mastered it, the corner of his mouth move in something that was, unmistakably, almost a laugh. It did not arrive, but it came closer than she had ever seen it come, and Mrs. Tatch, appearing in the doorway behind him with an armful of linen, caught Agnes's eye over his shoulder and gave her a single, satisfied nod, as though a very long column had finally, after years of resisting, begun to add. He did not speak of what he had seen that night, not directly, but something in the house shifted after it, the way weather shifts before anyone can name the change. He sought her out in the estate office earlier each evening. He began, without announcement, to ask her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with ledgers, the placement of a hedge, the wisdom of a tenant's petition, and to listen to her answers with a gravity she suspected he extended to almost no one else living. It was on one such evening, the fire burned low and the house gone quiet around them, that he told her, haltingly, as a man unused to the shape of confession in his own mouth, that he had a sister, Marianne, 16 and clever, and entirely unprepared for a world that had already, once, tried to use her carelessly. There is a debt, he said, that concerns her, one I have not yet found the means to settle honestly, and until I do, I would rather she not know the whole of its shape. It touches her happiness more nearly than I like. Agnes asked nothing further, though the shape of the secret pressed against her curiosity like a held breath, and he seemed, in the not asking, to trust her a fraction more than he had the night before, which she understood, without either of them saying so, to be the true currency of this strange marriage, paid out slowly, in installments, like a debt honestly owed. The half-truth arrived, as such things do, dressed in Simon Price's beautiful gray coat and his gentlest voice, on a wet afternoon when the Duke had ridden out to a distant tenancy and would not return before dark. Price found Agnes in the small parlor with a lap full of household accounts and greeted her with the particular warmth he reserved for moments when he intended to do the most damage. "My dear cousin," he said, settling uninvited into the chair across from her, "you look tired. Marriage to a man so occupied with his figures must be a lonely business." She said nothing, only waited, because she had learned in 6 years of service that silence drew more truth from a false man than any question could. He studied her a moment, then sighed, as though reluctant, as though it pained him. "I wonder whether Gideon has explained to you the particular terms of the trust that made this marriage so very urgent," he said. "No," he continued, watching her face with open interest. "I thought not. He is not a man given to unnecessary disclosures. The estate's trust, my dear, releases a very considerable sum the moment he marries, a sum that has been rather badly needed these 3 years past, and releases it, I am afraid, regardless of whom he marries, so long as the lady is respectable and entirely without connections likely to make trouble afterward. He watched that land, and it did, though she gave him nothing on her face to reward him with. You were chosen, Miss Bell, he said, gently, for having no one, no family to write letters, no patron to ask questions, no attachment strong enough to survive an annulment quietly arranged once the funds are secured and the difficulty, whatever it is, resolved. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I think you are a woman who would rather know the shape of the ground she stands on than be surprised by it later. There is a clause, he added, almost as an afterthought, almost kindly, in the settlement itself, permitting exactly such a resolution before the year is out, without scandal to him and without recourse to you. I have seen the document. I drew a portion of it myself. Agnes sat very still, the way she had stood outside the study door on the first morning of all this, counting what remained solid, and found, for the first time since her father died, that she could not immediately locate it. She did not confront the Duke that night, because he did not return until the small hours, but she carried Price's words with her through 2 sleepless nights, turning them the way she turned a suspect column, looking for the seam where the sum went wrong, and could not, try as she might, find one that satisfied her, because the arithmetic of it fit too neatly with everything she already knew. The haste, the secrecy, the clause he had never once mentioned. When she finally asked him, it was in the estate office, with the ledgers open between them as though the question belonged there among the figures, plainly business to business. "Is there a clause," she asked, "permitting you to set this marriage aside once the trust is released, without scandal, and without my consent required?" He did not deny it. That was the wound of it, that he did not deny it, only went very still, the stillness of a man taking a blow, without letting his face report it, and said, after a silence that told her more than any answer could have, that such a clause existed, that his solicitor had insisted upon it as a matter of course, and that he had not thought it worth troubling her with, because he had never intended to use it. "Never intended," she repeated, and heard her own voice come out flatter than she meant it to, is a very different promise from cannot. He rose, came round the desk, stood close enough that she could see the effort it cost him to speak plainly. "Agnes," he said, using her given name for perhaps the 3rd time since their marriage, "there are things I have not told you that I would give a great deal to tell you now, and cannot, not yet, not without endangering someone who has already paid more than her share for my father's mistakes. I am asking you to trust a man who has given you very little cause to. I know it." She looked at him a long moment, weighing the man against the clause, the kneeling scullery laughter against the cold study door, and found that she could not, in honesty, separate the two, and that the not knowing was becoming a weight she had not agreed to carry. "I have never asked you for affection," she said finally. "I did not think I would mind its absence. I find I mind the uncertainty a great deal more." She left him standing among the ledgers, and did not look back to see what crossed his face, though Mrs. Tatch, passing her in the corridor, took one look and said nothing at all. Which was, from Mrs. Tatch, its own kind of eloquence. Price came to her again 3 days later, this time with an offer rather than a wound, delivered over tea with the pleasant informality of a man discussing the weather. He had, he said, a small property in the north, modest but respectable, and a sum sufficient to maintain a gentlewoman there in perfect comfort for the whole of her life, entirely her own, requiring nothing of her but a quiet withdrawal from the marriage before Michaelmas, and a signature on a single paper releasing all further claim. No scandal need attach to either party, he said. Gideon secures his trust regardless of the manner of the parting, and you secure an independence such as women of your circumstances rarely see offered twice. I call it, if I may say so, a very generous arithmetic. Agnes looked at the paper he laid upon the table between them, at the sum written there in his own elegant hand, more money than she had seen in her whole life, enough to never again stand outside a door listening for whether she would still have a roof by nightfall, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, of her father signing his name to columns he had not falsified over and over until it cost him everything, because a bargain honestly kept was the only inheritance he had believed himself entitled to leave behind. I have never yet signed my name to a thing I did not fully understand, she said, and I find I understand this rather less than you would like me to. She pushed the paper back across the table, and Price's smile, for the first time since she had met him, did not quite hold its shape. You are, he said, rising, a very inconvenient sort of honest, Miss Bell, and I confess I had hoped you would be more sensible." "So had several other people," she said, and did not rise to see him out. The frame closed around her faster than she expected. Within the week, a discrepancy was discovered in the household accounts she herself had been keeping, a sum of £40 unaccounted for, and the entry, when produced before the Duke by Price with an expression of pained reluctance, was written in a hand disturbingly close to her own, close enough that a man who did not know her father's teaching from the inside might easily have been persuaded. "I do not accuse you, cousin," Price said, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering the worst blow of the evening. "I only observe that it is a very great deal of money to have gone astray in a house managed by a woman new to its accounts, and that the timing is, whatever else it is, unfortunate." The Duke did not speak in her defense as quickly as she needed him to. She saw the calculation cross his face, saw him weigh what he could say against what he had sworn to protect, saw him choose, in the space of a breath too long, silence over her name, and something in her chest went as cold and still as the study door had been on the first morning of all this. "I see," she said, before he could recover himself, and left the room before either man could watch her decide what she felt about it. That night, she packed the small trunk she had arrived with, because a woman accused of theft in a house not yet fully her own had, she reasoned, very little choice but to remove herself before the accusation hardened into fact, and she was in the passage with her hand on the latch when Mrs. Tatch appeared out of the dark, holding a candle and, tucked beneath her arm, an old and battered tea caddy that Agnes recognized, after a moment, as the very one the kitchen children used for their game of pitched peas. "There's something you ought to see before you go anywhere, girl," Mrs. Tatch said, and her voice, for once, had none of its dryness in it at all. Old Hob, God rest him, kept the accounts before Mr. Price ever came into his post, and he was dying 3 years back when he pressed this into little Biddy's hands and told her it was a treasure, to be kept safe and never opened till the right person asked for it. "She's a child. She thought it a game. I only thought, tonight, watching you stand there with your trunk packed, that perhaps the right person had finally asked." Agnes set down her trunk. Inside the caddy, wrapped in oilcloth gone soft with age, lay a single folded page in a careful, old-fashioned clerk's hand, a true copy of the bond old Hob had drawn the week before his final illness, showing a debt of £1,100 against the estate, taken by the late Duke to cover his daughter's medical care in a season when Marianne had nearly died of a fever no physician could name. A debt honestly incurred and, Agnes saw at a glance, honestly recorded, in a sum that bore almost no resemblance to the £2,900 now claimed due in the ledgers Price had been keeping since. Beside it lay a letter in the old Duke's own failing hand, addressed to no one in particular, confessing his fear that his man of business had begun, in small ways, to help himself to sums he believed too minor to be missed, and his intention, once his health permitted, to have the accounts independently examined. He had not lived long enough to keep that promise. Agnes sat down upon the trunk she had packed to leave the house forever and read the 2 documents through twice, and felt, for the first time in 7 weeks, the cold, clean certainty of a column finally, fully balanced. A column that will not balance is not asking to be forgiven, her father used to say, setting down his pen at the end of a long night's work. It is asking to be found. She rose and asked Mrs. Tatch, in a voice that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last minute, whether Sir Aldous Crane, the family's trustee, was expected in the county before Michaelmas, and Mrs. Tatch, watching the change come over her the way one watches weather finally break, allowed herself something close to a smile and said that he was expected in 4 days' time for the quarterly reading of the accounts, as he had been every year of the old Duke's life and every year since. 4 days gave her time enough, and she spent every hour of them with a discipline her father would have recognized and been proud of, comparing Hobbs' true bond against 3 years of Price's doctored entries line by line until the pattern of the forgery stood out to her as plainly as a wrong sum in a schoolboy's sums. A slow, patient inflation of interest compounded upon interest that never existed, skimmed a little at a time into accounts she now traced, with growing and terrible certainty, to a small property purchased 18 months prior in Simon Price's own name. She did not go to the Duke with it directly. She went instead to Marianne, 16 and clever and frightened in the particular way of a girl who has spent years being managed rather than told the truth, and found the girl not fragile at all once given a plain account of the danger, but fierce and willing, when Agnes explained what was needed, to stand before Sir Aldous Crane herself and say what she had never been permitted to say before, that she had once overheard Mr. Price threaten, in this very house, to see her fever debt made public as proof of the family's ruin, unless certain papers were signed in his favor. It was Marianne, too, who remembered that Mr. Dunmore, Price's own clerk, had complained once, bitterly and in his cups at the harvest supper, of having been made to copy figures he did not like the look of, and had been made to sign his name beneath them all the same. Agnes found the Duke at last on the 3rd evening, in the estate office among the same ledgers where they had begun, and laid the true bond and the old Duke's letter upon the desk between them without preamble, because there was no version of this moment that benefited from softening. "I did not take your £40, she said. "I believe I know now who did, and how, and I believe I can prove it before witnesses in 4 days' time, if you will trust me long enough to let me try." He read the letter in his father's hand slowly, and when he lifted his face to hers, it had gone the pale, stripped color of a man watching an old wound reopen and, at the same instant, finally begin to close. "I have spent 3 years believing my father careless," he said. "I would have given a great deal once simply to know he was not." He looked at her a long moment. "I am sorry," he said, "for the silence in that room. I chose wrongly. I will not choose wrongly again." It was not yet the whole truth between them, but it was, Agnes thought, the first honest entry either of them had made in the ledger of this marriage since the morning it began. The reading of the accounts took place, as it had every year of the old Duke's life, in the long dining room, with Sir Aldous Crane presiding at the head of the table, a spare, precise, entirely incorruptible old man who had known the family 50 years and trusted no one's arithmetic but his own. Simon Price arrived immaculate, as always, greeting Agnes with a warmth that did not waver even as his eyes flicked, once, to the folded papers she held before her like a hand of cards she had not yet chosen to play. Mrs. Tatch stood along the wall with the other senior servants, arms folded, watching Price the way a hawk watches a field mouse it has already decided is dinner. Marianne sat beside her brother, pale but steady, her hands folded in a manner Agnes recognized, with a small ache, as an imitation of her own composure, learned and borrowed for exactly this occasion. Sir Aldous opened the proceedings with the customary reading of the quarter's sums, delivered by Price in his easy, confident hand, and it was only when he reached the entry for the estate's outstanding bond, £2,900 and rising, that Agnes rose from her place and asked, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the table without once climbing toward a shout, whether Sir Aldous would permit her to lay an older record beside the one Mr. Price had just read. There was a silence of the particular quality that settles over a room the instant before it understands it is about to change. Sir Aldous, who had not risen for anyone in a decade, rose now and asked to see it. She laid old Hobbs' true bond upon the table, held it to the candlelight so the fainter, older ink could be seen against the newer, and set beside it, page by page. 3 years of Price's ledgers, the seams of the forgery showing now like a scar under strong light, sums quietly inflated, interest compounded where none had ever been agreed, entries in a hand Sir Aldous, bending close, pronounced without hesitation to differ from the old Duke's own signature in a dozen small damning particulars. Price's composure, which had survived every blow before this one, began at last to fray at its edges, a tightness entering his beautiful voice as he protested that documents could be forged as easily by a desperate new bride as by an honest man of long service, and it was Marianne, rising unbidden beside her brother, who delivered the second blow, repeating in a clear, unshaking voice the threat she had once overheard in this very house, word for word, the color rising in Price's face for the first time since Agnes had known him. It was Mr. Dunmore, summoned at Sir Aldous' quiet order, and seated at the far end of the table with the particular misery of a man who has known this day was coming for a year and hoped daily it would not, who broke entirely under a single question, put to him gently by Sir Aldous, whether he had, or had not, copied fair the very entries now spread upon the table at Mr. Price's direction and over his own private objection. He wept before he answered. He answered anyway, and once he had begun he could not seem to stop, 3 years of small complicities pouring out of him in a rush that named sums, dates, the little property purchased 18 months before, until Price, watching his own clerk unmake him in real time, sat very still and said nothing at all. The silence of a man who has finally run out of gentle voices to use. When at last he spoke, it was not to deny it, it was to say, in a voice stripped for the first time of all its silk, that he had watched Gideon inherit everything. The title, the house, the name, while he himself, one entail short of all of it, had been left to manage another man's fortune and call it generosity, and that somewhere in the counting of another man's money he had stopped being able to tell the difference between wages and theft. It was, Agnes thought, watching him, the first true thing he had said in her hearing, and she found she believed the grief in it even as she did not, for one moment, excuse the rest. Sir Aldous, after a long silence, pronounced that the matter would not go before the assizes, out of regard for the family name and for Marianne's future prospects, which a public trial would do more to wound than any private settlement could repair, but that Mr. Price would surrender the property purchased with the estate's stolen sums, relinquish all further office in the family's affairs, and remove himself, that same week, to a small annuity in a distant county sufficient to keep him from want and insufficient to keep him from remembering, every quarter day for the rest of his life, precisely what he had traded for it. It is not mercy to him, Sir Aldous said, when Price, ashen now, seemed about to protest. It is mercy to a 16-year-old girl who does not deserve to spend her come-out season answering questions about a scandal not of her making. You will take it, and be grateful someone in this room still has the grace to offer it. He left within the hour, and the house exhaled around his absence the way a room exhales when a long-held breath is finally released. And it was some while before Agnes understood that the Duke had left the dining room entirely, and found him at last in the estate office, standing at the window with his hands behind his back, exactly as he had stood on the first morning she ever saw him, though everything about the way he held himself now seemed to have unclenched by some careful, deliberate degree. "You have given me back my father," he said, without turning. "I do not know how to thank a woman for that with anything so small as words." She came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said that she had not done it for thanks, that she had done it because a column that would not balance had never once, in her whole life, been able to hold her attention until it was found. He turned to her then, and there was nothing of the study door's flatness left in his face at all. "The trust released its sum the day we married," he said. "It is done. Settled. There is no clause between us any longer that requires anything of you at all, no reason left that could compel you to stay 1 hour longer than you wish to. I am telling you this first, before anything else, because I would rather lose you honestly than keep you on false terms one day more." Agnes felt something in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as the particular ache of a ledger closing clean. "Then ask me properly," she said, "and I will give you a proper answer." He took her hand, not as a duke settling terms, but as a man asking something he had no right to assume, and said that he had not married her for her name or her silence, or even, though he had told himself so at the start, for her skill with figures, but because in 7 weeks she had done what no one in this house had managed in 3 years, taught it how to laugh again, and that he loved her. Plainly, entirely, for no reason a solicitor could write into any settlement, and would go on loving her whether she stayed or not, though he hoped, with a hope he had not allowed himself in longer than he could remember, that she would stay. "Terms plain," she said softly, testing the old words in her mouth and finding them changed, and sentiment no longer set aside. He laughed then, at last, the real thing this time, low and startled out of him, the first full laugh she had heard from him since the day he watched her miss a scullery caddy on purpose, and Marianne, arriving in the doorway in search of them both, stopped dead at the sound of it and pressed both hands over her mouth, because she, too, had waited 3 years to hear it. They were married again in the small stone chapel that October, quietly, before no one but the household and Sir Aldous, and a weeping Mrs. Tatch, not because the law required it, but because Agnes had asked, half laughing, whether a woman might not be permitted one wedding conducted for love instead of arithmetic, and the Duke had agreed before she finished the sentence. Marianne stood as witness in a gown the color of the first turning leaves, and cried through the whole of it, and Ferris, Biddy, and the smallest of the kitchen children stood at the chapel door in their good clothes, having been promised sugared plums for good behavior, and Ferris, unable to contain himself at the crucial moment, called out that Mrs. B. looked very fine, which set the whole small congregation laughing in the middle of the vows, and the Duke, rather than frowning, laughed hardest of all. Miss Cordelia Vane, the heiress once proposed as Price's instrument, wrote a warm and unexpectedly wise letter that winter, having heard the whole story from Sir Aldous, thanking Agnes for having spared her a marriage neither of them would have wanted. And the two women became, in time, unlikely and steady friends, Cordelia marrying 2 years later, a quiet naturalist, entirely of her own choosing. Miss Dunmore, whose confession had broken the case open, was given a modest post in a neighboring county where his talent for figures could be watched and, in time, trusted again. Simon Price lived out his years in his distant county on his small annuity, and Agnes heard, some years on, that he had taken up gardening with unexpected patience, which she chose, privately, to consider a kind of grace. Her father's old employer, written to at last with the true story of a forged column laid plain, sent back a letter clearing a dead man's name 11 years too late to comfort him. But not too late, Agnes found, to comfort her. Ferris, Biddy, and the other kitchen children were kept on, and at Agnes's quiet insistence taught their letters alongside their scullery work, and grew up calling the Duchess of Harrow nothing but Mrs. B for the whole of their childhoods, a name the Duke himself, adopted within the year, murmured across a pillow or a ledger with a private tenderness that made Marianne roll her eyes and Mrs. Tatch pretend not to notice at all. A year turned. On a cool morning, very like the one that had begun it all. Agnes stood once more outside the estate office, this time with a small girl of her own on her hip, born that spring, and already, Mrs. Tatch swore, possessed of her mother's exact, unimpressed stare, and heard through the half-open door not cold arithmetic, but her husband's voice, low and warm, reading aloud to the baby from a column of figures as though it were a lullaby. Because he had taken, since the wedding, to claiming that all the best stories in this house had started in a ledger, and he saw no reason to break the habit. She pushed the door open all the way this time, and did not stand outside listening, and he looked up and smiled the whole, unguarded smile she had spent a year teaching him how to keep. If this story warmed you, the way a cold house can be taught, patiently, to laugh again, then stay a while longer by the fire with me, because I have the kettle on, and a chair kept warm, and no shortage of quiet evenings left to fill. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you longest, the one spoken through a closed door, or the one finally spoken plain? And while you are here, keep your place among the regulars who gather at this hearth each week, for there is always room for one more. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, as she was, with the ones who never once expected anyone to come looking for them.